The late Bronze Age was a world overflowing with confidence. Palaces glittered with gold and imported treasures. Ships carried copper, tin, wine, spices, and luxury goods across a vast network of international trade. Kings addressed each other as brothers. Scribes recorded agreements that stretched from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia. It was the first truly connected world, and the people living within it believed the system was strong enough to last forever. But within a single lifetime, that world unraveled. Cities burned, palaces fell silent, trade routes collapsed, writing systems disappeared. Entire cultures vanished so completely that no one even remembered they had existed until archaeologists rediscovered their ashes thousands of years later. It remains one of the most dramatic and mysterious collapses in human history. And here is the twist almost everyone misses. That collapse reshaped the world that followed. It opened the way for the rise of Iron Age cultures like the Israelites, the Phoenicians, and the early Greeks. The end of one world became the blueprint for the next 1,000 years. So how do you get from a glittering international network to a fragmented landscape of abandoned cities and new cultures struggling to survive? And what chain of events was powerful enough to bring the ancient world to its knees? Well, that story begins with the first subtle signs that this golden age was already starting to crack. Setting the stage, the world before the fall. 3,000 years ago, the eastern Mediterranean was alive with confidence. Mycenaean Greece ruled from fortified palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, where warriors wore gleaming bronze armor. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia from its mighty capital at Hattusa. Egypt still held the prestige of its great pharaohs, and smaller but wealthy cities like Ugarit thrived on coastal trade. It was a world of shared goods, shared ideas, and shared expectations. Copper came from Cyprus, tin traveled from Central Asia, ivory from Africa. Luxury items flowed along the trade routes that stitched the ancient world together. The system was complex, interdependent, and astonishingly advanced. But complexity is a double edge. When everything is connected, a single break can ripple outward with consequences no king could foresee. And the first sign of trouble appeared not in the heart of a palace, but on the horizon. A world on fire. Between 1200 and 1150 BC, destruction struck with terrifying speed. Archaeologists find ash layers across dozens of once thriving cities. Ugarit burned so quickly that letters begging for help were still sitting unopened when the ruins were excavated. The Hittite capital was abandoned. Mycenaean palaces fell one after another, families fled, trade collapsed, warriors dispersed. A civilization that had stood for centuries seemed to crumble overnight. But collapses rarely begin with the flames we see. Something had already been weakening the system long before the first city burned. And to find it, we need to follow the smoke back to the sea. Raiders from the sea. Egyptian inscriptions describe terrifying groups arriving in great waves. Entire families came by ship bringing carts, animals, and weapons unfamiliar to the region. Later historians called them the Sea Peoples. But at the time, they were simply a mystery. An unstoppable force that moved from coast to coast, attacking cities and shattering defenses. Ugarit pleaded for military support, but help never arrived. Cyprus fell into chaos. Even Egypt fought desperate battles to hold them back. Some believe the Sea Peoples were displaced Mycenaeans. Others suggest origins in Sicily, Sardinia, or the Balkans. Their clothing, weapons, and tactics varied wildly, hinting that this was not one group, but many peoples pushed into motion by something larger. Because here's the part that changes everything. These invaders were not the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of a far deeper problem unfolding across the entire region. So what exactly pushed whole populations into the sea? Well, that story begins with the sky. A sky without rain. Modern climate science reveals that around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean entered a severe and prolonged drought. Tree rings record years of low rainfall. Lakes receded. Crops failed across multiple kingdoms. The Hittites begged Egypt for grain. Mycenaean tablets show frantic attempts to manage dwindling food supplies. A palace system built on steady agricultural surplus simply could not handle scarcity. Food became scarce, then precious, then political. Hungry people become desperate people, and desperate people do things kings cannot control. But famine does not explain everything. Not the burned palaces, not the abandoned fortresses, not the sudden violence that tore through the heart of once stable kingdoms. For that, we need to look inside the palace walls themselves, the enemy within. Some cities destroyed during this period show no signs of foreign attack, no invading weapons, no siege damage. Instead, the fire seems to have come from the inside. Storerooms were emptied, throne rooms burned. Fortifications were torched by the very people they were built to protect. The Bronze Age was built on rigid hierarchy. When the system worked, it was impressive. But in a crisis, it became brittle. Mercenaries went unpaid. Farmers starved while elites stayed fed. Communities broke apart as trust in leadership evaporated. Civil wars, revolts, power struggles. The collapse was not just an external invasion, it was an internal implosion. But even revolt cannot explain the full devastation of the collapse. Because while societies fought themselves and starved, another force was shaking the world apart beneath their feet. Earthquakes, plague, and a shifting war machine. Across the region, archaeological layers show collapsed walls and shattered buildings that point to a series of earthquakes striking in clusters. Some researchers call this a quake storm, a period in which tectonic activity repeatedly hit vulnerable cities already weakened by famine and rebellion. And while the earth shook, something else may have been spreading through the region. DNA from Bronze Age burials shows strains of Yersinia pestis, the bacteria behind the Black Death. Disease would have moved quickly among starving, displaced populations. At the same time, warfare itself was changing. Chariot armies, once the height of Bronze Age military power, were becoming outmatched by more flexible infantry armed with new weapons and tactics. The old world was not prepared for this shift, and they paid the price. The system was being squeezed from every direction. But the final blow did not come from a single disaster. It came from the collapse of the system itself. When the system collapses. The Late Bronze Age worked because everything was connected. Every kingdom relied on the others for trade, diplomacy, raw materials, and food. When drought cut agriculture, kingdoms struggled. When sea peoples disrupted trade, copper and tin became scarce. Without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no weapons. Without weapons, there was no army. Without an army, there was no kingdom. Each failure triggered the next. Trade fell, security fell, trust fell, and once the network snapped, no kingdom was strong enough to rebuild it. The collapse did not just destroy cities. It erased the world that had held them together. But while the old world fell apart, something new was quietly taking shape in the ruins. After the fall, by 1100 BC, the glittering palaces of the Bronze Age were gone. Greece entered a centuries-long dark age. The Hittites disappeared entirely. Egypt survived, but never regained its former dominance. Writing systems vanished in several regions. Populations scattered into hills and small villages. Yet from this darkness emerged the cultures that would shape the next era. The Phoenicians rebuilt trade and created the alphabet. The Israelites emerged as a distinct people. Iron technology spread. And centuries later, the Greeks re-emerged, telling stories of heroes who lived in a world that had vanished long before. The end of the Bronze Age was not simply a collapse. It was a transformation. Which leads us to the final question that echoes through all of history. If a connected world as powerful as the Bronze Age could fall so quickly, what does that mean for us? The Bronze Age did not fall because of one disaster. It fell because many disasters collided at once. Invasion, famine, rebellion, earthquakes, plague, and the breakdown of international trade created a perfect storm that no empire could withstand. The collapse was rapid, global in scale, and total. And it holds a lesson that feels uncomfortably familiar today. Complex societies are strong, but they are also fragile. The more connected the world becomes, the more vulnerable it is to cascading failure. So, perhaps the real question is not how the Bronze Age collapsed, It is whether it could happen again.